Thank you guys for joining us for Cyber Psychology speaker series. I'd like to introduce Dr. Irving Berkowitz. He's the Emeritus Dean of Academic Affairs at Palm Beach State College, previous Assistant Dean of Social Work here at Norfolk State University. He retired in 2020 after 42 years in higher education, highly respected scholar in social policy. He served as a political advisor to post-communist governments in Romania and Albania. He is the son of Holocaust survivors, and he's dedicated his life to promoting human rights, justice, and diversity. During this time, he's given several talks focusing on the Nazis' use of propaganda and the pseudoscience, misinformation, disinformation, that's used to exploit public perception. So with that introduction in mind, Dr. Berkowitz, I'd like to just ask you if you could briefly explain your area of expertise and where you developed an interest in human rights and politics, especially given your background in social work.
Well, I'm sure, I'm glad to. And but before I do, I want to tell everyone what an honor, a real privilege it is to come back to Norfolk State University. And there's a story behind this that most people don't know. And of course, you've been told that I'm the son of Holocaust survivors. So let me start by saying that I lost my entire extended family. My uncles, grandparents, cousins, all of them. My mother and my father were the sole survivors of their large families. But when my family came here, my parents came here after years of being in a detention camp. This is not a concentration camp, but a DP camp where survivors of the Holocaust had to remain from 1 to several years. They finally made it to the United States. And at that time, my mother was 8.5 months pregnant with me. And just as we came through Ellis Island, I was born 3 weeks later. My brother was born in Germany. But what most people don't know is that at that time, early 1950s, Jews, particularly Jews arriving from Europe, were not permitted to live in suburbs. Not being permitted to is a legal constraint, but of course, the affordability or lack of affordability prevented most Jews from living there anyway. So we were relegated to living in ghettos. And I grew up in what remains a Jewish ghetto in the city of Cleveland. And of course, we coexisted with African Americans that were living in the inner city ghetto of Cleveland. That's how I grew up. But here's the real point of my story, is that it was African Americans that taught my mother and father how to speak English. And I knew I would be forever indebted to the Black community for embracing my family, growing up with them, teaching them how to speak. And I resolved long before I got to college that I would do everything I could to give back to the Black community, because what I derived, what my family derived, was invaluable. And so, sure enough, only my second year out of doctoral school, the opportunity arose. I saw a position being advertised at Norfolk State. And I applied for the position, and I sure enough got it. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't very long before I ascended the hierarchy from being an assistant professor to becoming a full professor at one point in my teaching at Norfolk State. I received the Roy Wood Teacher of Distinguished Professor Award at Norfolk State for my teaching.
Yeah.
And then Ethelyn Strong, the first dean of the School of Social Work here, and a woman who she created so many firsts for Black women in the state of Virginia. But when her longtime associate dean finally retired, she installed me to be the associate dean. And that's where I stayed until 1985, when I moved on to Michigan to become a dean. And so that's my story of how I got to Norfolk State, and the love and the loyalty that I will always have for this place.
So wonderful trajectory, and it's really interesting to find not just where you are right now, or anyone where we are right now, but how we got here is a really important piece of the puzzle, and a good preface for where this talk can go today. So with that in mind, the first thing I just wanted to mention was, tomorrow is going to be the 80th commemoration of Yom HaShoah, which is Holocaust Remembrance. 1945 really wasn't that long ago, if you think about it. It's more important than ever, given the rise of racism, anti-Semitism, not just in the US, but around the world. And so we really need to remember the lives lost during the Holocaust. At least 11 million people, 6 million Jews, 5 million who were not Jews. So it happened to a diverse range of people. And we need to know about the generational traumas that have happened because of it. And in that sense, I really want to equate it to similar generational trauma, similar to how slavery in the US started 1619, with consequences persisting through the present. So continuing to talk and teach next generations of people about stories from the voices of the people who lived through it, and actually this winds up giving us permission as a society, as a culture, to have open and frank conversations about what's happening in the world today. And I really want to emphasize that we're all allowed to have our own individual thoughts and opinions. That's about things that are happening all over the world, especially here in the United States is where I want to focus on in terms of the application of your background and your expertise. So I want to get your thoughts a little bit about how this new form of media communication, which is social media, in particular, how it's influencing public discourse, especially about world events, US events, political polarization, basic human rights that in some ways we're kind of seeing becoming eroding in front of our very eyes. We're living through it in real time. So kind of specifically, is social media doing more to create these echo chambers where vitriolic, voices, loud, angry voices are persisting and being elevated more so than just passionate debate where people can respect each other's opinions? Even if we don't agree with each other, we can still learn from each other.
Well, that's a very expansive area to address. But before I get into the social media platforms, I think it's important to just start with the importance of learning history. I understand now that there are states in which students can receive an undergraduate degree without taking a history class. So what are the implications of that? What are the implications of not learning about our history, our American history, African American history, Jewish history, European history? The result is that without educating future generations about history, we relive it. The one thing we all know, excuse me, the one thing we all know is you can't unlive history. You can't unlive it, but you can relive it. And generations that are growing up without knowing about slavery, without knowing about the civil rights movement, without knowing about the Holocaust. The same people who fail to learn about that maybe don't realize, especially young people, how what they are doing today might actually be contributing to the process of reliving it. How can you combat something that is manifest today without knowing its roots? And you've mentioned social media platforms. Well, let's go back to the Holocaust. Certainly people are familiar with the name of Joseph Goebbels. Joseph Goebbels' title was Minister of Propaganda. That was his title. Now, just understand, propaganda is the misuse of information, the distortion of information in such a way that as it propagates lies, the more those lies are propagated, the louder they're propagated, the longer they're propagated, the more likely they are to be believed. And what results from believing lies? Well, let's go back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau of the Enlightenment. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, if they can convince you of absurdities, they can cause you to commit atrocities. If you are convinced of the absurdities that are being propagated, it could motivate you to commit atrocities. And so, yes, we have to, at the risk of some people saying, but you can't restrict free speech. At what point do we draw the line on college campuses today, where free speech becomes hate speech? And what happens when free speech turns to hate speech? It incites violence, and it has. Violence toward African Americans, violence toward Jews, violence toward Asians, and violence toward Muslims. The question is not whether or not free speech is protected, but whether one can defend hate speech when we know what the outcome is. And it's up to us to teach each generation how to discern truth from fallacy. Because imagine what Joseph Goebbels could have done had he had Facebook or Twitter. Look at what was accomplished. Look at the hate that was fomented without social media platforms. There were newspapers every day that Germans received. It was called Die Stürmer. The Die Stürmer means the assault, a storm. Like stormtroopers. And every day in the newspaper, at the bottom of the page, there was a German expression, Die Juden sind unser Unglück, which meant, for Germans, it meant the Jews are the cause of your misfortune. And they saw that every day. And what is that all about? When you want to marginalize a group, you start by accusing them of things that are absurd. When somebody thinks, when the first question that we ask when we're beset by misfortune, when the first question we ask is, who did this to me? We immediately project ourselves as a victim. when somebody says, now, what is it that I did, or what is it that I didn't do that brought this circumstance upon me? That person is looking within. So social media platforms today find it very easy and with compelling consequences to project the blame on a scapegoat, on somebody else. And that when you think that your misfortune owes to what they did, them, there's us and them, that other people, then you develop hostility toward them. And, you know, it's the difference between disliking somebody, because we all have discriminating tastes. There are things we dislike, there are people we dislike, but we don't want them dead. When you cross that line between disliking someone and hating someone, and hating them because they've been portrayed as evil, who wants to coexist with evil? What do people want to do? They want to eliminate evil. And so that hatred can escalate to a point of violence. And that's what's happened throughout history to Jewish people, is they've been portrayed as inferior. Blacks and Jews were portrayed in the racial ideology of the Third Reich. Blacks and Jews and gypsies were portrayed as subhuman and inferior in a society that wanted to perfect one race, what they thought was the superior race, the master race, the Aryan race. There was the Aryans, and then there was blacks and Jews and gypsies, and the policies that emanated from that hateful ideology. Those policies led to such things as sterilization. The Black community should know very well. We were sterilizing blacks in the United States without their consent, without their knowledge. Well, the Nazis did the same thing. But sterilization eventually led to euthanization. And disabled children, Jewish children, Black children, Gypsy children, they were euthanized because they contaminated the genetic pool. And this is why we have a common history that needs to be taught. And it's folly for us to think that the idyllic life that we lead can't collapse in an instant, overnight, and suddenly find yourself and your family, like my family, running for their lives. So social media platforms play a big role in propagating hate and inculcating new generations with misinformation.
Yeah, and there's several points that a couple other questions I'll follow up on. One of the things that you mentioned that I'd like to go next is, and to connect this with psychology, anyone who's ever taken an intro to psych course has, usually in chapter 1, they'll be exposed to the idea of what pseudoscience is. And you know, white people who have claimed that Black people are inferior, like you mentioned, used it to justify things like slavery. You know, Nazis claiming that they're the superior race, as you mentioned, some self-proclaimed reason, as opposed to something that's based in some type of empirical science. This is just maybe based in propaganda. This is all applications of pseudoscience or outcomes of using pseudoscience for that propaganda purposes or misinformation, disinformation, as we would experience it now. So, basically it's anything that's presented as fact, but there's massive holes in the science that's used to justify these claims. So, one of the things I think that's relevant right now is when you masquerade pseudoscience as fact, it's how propaganda is used to keep people angry, playing on people's basic human emotions, anger, disgust, things like that. Empowers people who have authoritarian tendencies to weaponize information. I think that's a big thing that we're hearing more about right now is weaponization of information. And it creates confusion among people, distrust amongst people. Very easily done on social media by deploying disinformation and malinformation. And, just as an example, consider in 2021, the White House at that point referred to alternative facts, in a press conference. So I think this is just the modern day equivalent of malinformation, essentially. Malinformation is when real information, such as facts, are used to deliberately and purposefully misconstrue the information that's presented to people, deliberately to misdirect people. So this is different from misinformation, for example, which is it's false information that maybe people are conveying without knowing. So it's not as malicious. Disinformation is similar to malinformation in that you're purposely trying to deceive people by saying something that's completely false. So malinformation is focusing on facts that people can wrap their head around that have some legitimacy based in, in a shared reality, whereas disinformation is just false, claiming President Obama was not a U.S. citizen when it's plainly, complete, falsehood. That's an example of deploying malinformation. So with those definitions in mind, what is your opinion about how easy or difficult it was 80 years ago during, even before that, the rise of Nazi Germany, to hijack, hack, socially engineer our basic human emotions? Again, fear, anger, disgust, through socially engineering that through the use of pseudoscience and malinformation.
Well, that's a great question, and that might be a great lecture for me to come back and give.
Absolutely.
Racial ideology in the Third Reich, racial ideology. But I think the shocker to people will be to learn that where Hitler got ideas about racial inferiority was America. Hitler's shaping of the Nuremberg laws, which segregated and discriminated against Africans, Black Africans, and Jews and Gypsies, anyone that was considered non-pure, non-Aryan. That came from the Jim Crow South. He even said so. He modeled those laws after the Jim Crow South. And what we're calling, racial ideology or racial inferiority, there was a name for pseudoscience. It was called eugenics. And I would want the audience, I would want to come back and amplify on the pseudoscience of eugenics. It was huge in America. In the late 19th century, the first president of Stanford University, wrote books on eugenics. The idea that we could better the human race, we could improve the human race by going into the genetic pool of humanity and systematically eliminating inferior races, limiting their ability to propagate. And they did. There was California alone sterilized 66,000 people. And I guarantee you, they were Black, they were disabled, sterilized them because it polluted the genetic pool. And imagine a policy of improving the human race, a part of the human race, by destroying another part of the human race. Human improvement through destruction. And that became the policy of the Third Reich. So understanding where that ideology came from. But the other thing is, when you're talking about propaganda, keep in mind you also have to consider the historical context. Germany lost not one war. They lost 2 world wars. They lost the First World War. And if you know your history, Germany surrendered in World War I, and there was not one enemy soldier's footprint on German soil. I just want you to think about that. Germany had lost 2 million soldiers in World War I, but how could they have surrendered when not one enemy footprint was inside of Germany? Well, but they did. They surrendered, and they were punished after the Treaty of Versailles. And they had that period between World War I and World War II where conditions were imposed on Germany for making reparations for all the destruction in Europe. And I'll finish this briefly, but like I said, I have to come back and amplify this. The German people were at a loss to understand how this could have happened, until a very charismatic young man came along and said, Germany lost because the Jews sold them out. And could blame the loss of World War I and the misery of the people living during the Weimar Republic between the First World War and the Second World War. And they believed it. They believed it, they embraced it, and when Hitler finally took power in 1933, after 7 years before writing Mein Kampf, my conflict, he said, the Jews, this inferior race, is trying to control the world. Now, try and reconcile that. How does an inferior race gain control of the world? But the thing is that he still was all about, he envisioned world domination. Germania was going to be the capital of the world. And there were groups of inferior beings that were not going to be exterminated. Black Africans were going to be enslaved, just like Jews were enslaved during the Holocaust, to do the work, but to be worked to death. Gypsies were going to be annihilated, and Jews were going to become extinct. And Hitler even was receiving from the concentration camps the brains, the skins, the skeletons of Jews, because he wanted to create a museum of an extinct race. I know I've strayed from your question, but understand how all of this, psychology is not just the study of human motivation, it's the study of human behavior. And, propaganda is not an end in itself. It is a means of getting people to act on what it is they've been led to believe. And they did. There were people that participated in the Third Reich with enthusiasm. And that's because the propaganda was so effective in inculcating in them this hatred. this unwillingness to coexist with these groups of people.
And I think my next question goes into something you mentioned a little earlier that I think directly connects with what you just said now. So I want to preface it a little bit just by mentioning, you mentioned psychology, focusing on motivation and behavior, and just to kind of introduce the idea or this field of cyberpsychology, which is the world that I exist in. It's essentially the intersection of digital technology and human behavior. So just extending it to this digital world, social media, things like that. There's a growing, I guess you can say, fear that algorithms that power artificial intelligence and the AI that actually decides what content that it feeds you into your social media feed, they're unconsciously shaping our attitudes and our biases and beliefs, and ultimately those lead to behaviors. Prejudicial behavior, stereotype behavior, hatred, things like that. So for this next question, I want you to consider specifically something called Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act, which is, and I'll read it verbatim, no provider or user of an interactive computer, remember this is 1996, interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. So in other words, social media, other digital platforms cannot be held legally liable for what their users, everyday people, users of social media post, whether it's misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. And I think the application that we just saw recently was Facebook deciding to get rid of their fact checking, right? And so I think they tried to, maybe some people believed it, that they're couching this in a free speech argument. I think it's just leveraging this this law, the Section 230, for their own personal gain, maybe at the cost of their social corporate responsibility, but profits are king, I suppose. So based on your experience and work that's related to human rights and social justice in particular, what might be some of the challenges, but maybe also some of the opportunities to overcome the intensity and severity of the negative attitudes that have been contributing to the type of polarization that we're seeing, especially in the last couple of years, where these social media platforms have decided on some level to abdicate their responsibility of what information gets posted in print online.
Well, so I'm just going to offer an opinion. This is not my area of expertise, but I don't think any of us should dismiss the motive of making profit. Why do businesses exist? Social media platforms are profit-making organizations, propagating hate, propagating disinformation is profitable. News broadcasts. It's amazing to me how news organizations no longer just report the news, but make the news. And they bombard us with this content that's got to be compressed into a very small time frame. But what is behind the choices they make on what to report on and how to report it? So I think the profit motive plays a large role in this. And look, I'm sick of hearing how people defend what is being communicated on social media as protecting free speech. Look at what's happening on college campuses. And now I'm going to just talk about Jewish students on college campuses that they're under siege. They're trapped in classrooms with violent mobs outside. calling for their destruction. Calling for the destruction of Jews. There is only one solution: intifada, revolution. Do you know what that means? Intifada is the murder of Jews. And they're yelling that outside of a classroom. I want to ask you, imagine if Black students were huddled in fear in a classroom while a mob was calling for the lynching of Blacks. Hatred, there's no one form of hatred that should be any more tolerable and acceptable than any other form of hatred. But that's what's happening. And social media platforms, there's an intent behind it. You use the word unconscious, not unconscious on their part, unconscious on the part of the recipient that sees this every day, and it's drilled into their minds that, this, it's not just hating Israel. Hating Israel, say, but I don't hate Jews. I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm an anti-Zionist. And yet when somebody boards a train in New York City and calls for any Zionist to stand up, who are they asking to stand up? Who are they asking to identify themselves? It's Jews. The thing is that we have to respond to how social media platforms are contributing. Look, you remember back in the days before social media, how we said violence on TV has that effect on kids. Why shouldn't we apply the same standard? There are standards. Even the social media platforms call them community standards. But you know what? They selectively enforce those standards. But we have to hold their feet to the fire. We have to hold them accountable. But more importantly, we have to teach a generation that's grown up around technology and social media. I don't know if you have seen in the last 2 months on social media. I urge those of you watching to go on YouTube and look up Hitler speeches using AI. Now what you can actually do is go on YouTube and you'll see Hitler delivering a speech in 1933 with the same animation, the way he was, and they have recreated his voice. And instead of delivering these speeches in German, he's speaking in English. And he's not saying exactly what he said in his speeches in 19, some of it, yes, but he's spewing this hatred, and particularly against some groups. But it's AI. You're watching Hitler delivering this speech. They'll show you the multitudes that have been gathered there to hear it, and he's delivering it in English. And don't think for a minute this doesn't have an effect on the attitudes and behaviors of people listening to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where the echo chambers online come into effect, with how AI connects you with some of this content. So if you aren't purposefully going and looking for this, you may still be exposed to it. Mm-hmm. And that's the scary part. And another part of being everything online, the people who are curating this content, creating this content, this is all user-generated content, because everybody individually has the same access to a platform. Everyone's voice that can exist in this echo chamber can amplify to whatever exponential power. these attitudes and thoughts, and the danger really becomes that it's a slippery slope to behavior. And so one of the things, I guess, just to go to connected to the next question, there's a lot of different ways that people become polarized. For now, we can kind of look at the connection between the political polarization, for example, even just in the US right now, and considering how culturally, it's not just political, it's also cultural. There's a huge cultural component to it where polarization is even deeply rooted in leveraging to a certain degree systemic inequalities, latent racism that exists in society, and even explicit and very overt racism. So I want you, if you can think of things in terms of how media in general continues to be used as a tool of propaganda, exploiting especially these basic human emotions like we talked about before, anger, fear in particular. What can people, younger people like you were mentioning, such as people from Gen Z, who, like you said, all grew up in a fully digital world, what can they learn from the lessons of the past that you've been referring to, related to how traditional forms of media, whether it was speeches or TV or newspapers, how they were used for exploitive purposes in particular, to generally just disenfranchise people, in particular, minorities?
As long as I can remember, it was very rare for people to focus on our common ground. Exploitation of differences. And once you start getting into differences, you start creating we and they, us and them. And eventually you start comparing, well, this group has more privilege than that group. And failing to recognize, I gave a Dr. Martin Luther King annual speech to the Urban League one year. And I was guided by the thought, what would Dr. King think about today? Well, I think he'd be in tears. He would acknowledge how far we've come because we had our first Black president. Now, President Obama had his problems. And there were no doubt people that it was not just because they were of a different party, but because they were of a different race. But you know what? Most people embraced Barack Obama, adored him. Most people, by the time Muhammad Ali died, they were mourning in Japan. Muhammad Ali belonged to all of us. Sure, he was Black, but he belonged to all of us. There is another side that doesn't seem to get the kind of attention that it does. We've come a long way. It doesn't mean that we've arrived. It doesn't mean that there isn't more that we can do. Problems don't get solved because laws are on the books, because laws cannot be enforced. But I can tell you this, I'm the first one to acknowledge that anti-Semitism no sooner came to an end after the Holocaust than racism came to an end after slavery. And that's something that Jews and Blacks have in common, that it's still a struggle, and that we need to march in each other's parades. Jews have marched in parades on behalf of civil rights. Blacks ought to march even more in our parade when Jew hatred reaches the point that it has. And I'm saying, if we understand the common ground we're on, and that we may have different cultures, but Dr. King used to say this. Dr. King, one of his famous quotes was, "We may have come here on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now." That's a powerful message. We're all in the same boat now. If we can cause that tide to rise, everyone will rise with it. No one form of bigotry is any more acceptable than any other form. And we should all be dedicated to fighting hate, combating it wherever it rears its head with the same passion and the same dedication.
And to that end, a month or two ago, maybe, there was a neo-Nazi, not march, but just they were putting flags over highway overpass. I think it was in Ohio. Might have been, I don't know if it was Cleveland or not, but didn't get a lot of press coverage. But online, it's there, and you can very easily find the videos. And these neo-Nazis are on the overpass, spewing their stuff. And just by chance, people coming around, walking around, driving around the neighborhood, there was a handful of just everyday African-American people who lived in that neighborhood who stopped them, the neo-Nazis, and drove them out and did not accept what was happening. And these neo-Nazis left with their tail between their legs. One or two people said something, and then other people from the community came and joined. No violence, just told them that it's unacceptable. Told them in, not no violence, but very adamantly, let's say. So I think to the point that you're making, and this speaks to from the last question, the opportunities that are available. There are a lot of opportunities for focusing on that common ground, to acknowledging being in the same boat, and focusing on the ways people can, collectively focus on moving forward and not backwards. So just to use that as a bridge to this next question, and it's the last question I do have. So if there's anyone that is on the live stream here, then if you have any questions, feel free to just put them in the chat. And after this last question, we can kind of go through them if there are any questions. So my last question for you, and I really want to thank you for your time and your, the way that you're explaining everything and connecting the dots. So I want to ask about political polarization that, in the US right now seems to be tearing apart the fabric of what our country has historically embraced, which I personally think is this hope that we'll continue to do what we reasonably can, as a highly diverse people with diverse culture and values and identities, which is the hope that we'll continue to do what we reasonably can to make things better, no matter how slow that process might be. Always working towards moving forward and not moving back. But our social safety net seems to be in jeopardy right now, just across the board. Social safety nets are being compromised. Things like climate change are being denied to the point where, again, it's exacerbating this polarization, even though it's not a pseudoscience. There's these empirical facts that need to be acknowledged. There's a lot of passivity with human rights violations, seem to be occurring all over the place. Even just the whitewashing of the impact of African Americans in US history. Recently, just the acknowledgement of Jackie Robinson's contribution to baseball was, just went missing from the web, the White House website. And to connect with something you mentioned earlier, in my opinion, we're also seeing people that are in power using the safety concerns of Jewish students on campus, college campuses, which are very real threats. Don't get me wrong, and I think this is where the malinformation comes into play. These are extremely relevant, real threats to these students, as you mentioned a little bit earlier. But I think these powers from a top-down level are using this to exploit their own agendas, to leverage their political agendas related to a highly warped, in my opinion, way of explaining, for example, what DEI actually is, and conflating. I think a lot of this is trying to conflate for the purpose of misguiding people, things like DEI with hot button issues like immigration or government efficiency, fairness of university administrative or educational policies, and things like that. What are some of the common threads that seem to transcend social media compared to other forms of media, traditional forms of media that we mentioned earlier, that we can all use today to combat rollbacks in inclusion, going backwards in terms of eliminating or trying to work towards eliminating systemic racism, again, combat the rise of blatant racism and anti-Semitism, this rise in authoritarianism that seems to have some momentum of acceptance, in order to counteract popular beliefs that political or other types of cultural polarization are intractable conflicts that have no peaceful end, which throughout human history, we know that there's no such thing as an intractable conflict. It's all about your attitude looking at the conflict and trying to reimagine and transform conflict into opportunities for growth. So I was just hoping to get your thoughts to kind of bring that all together.
All right. Well, that's also a very excellent question and expansive one. But when Jewish people, if you don't mind my saying, when Jewish people say never again, what they say never again starts with me. And so I've got to say, I agree. We can all take aim at government or take aim at a political party, and we can all fire salvos at them for what they do or what they don't do. But all of us have not only the opportunity, but I think we have the obligation, a moral imperative, to stand up and by first understanding what is happening, but standing up and standing by their convictions, by standing together. And if others don't join us, we stand alone. Stand up, stand together, to stand firm by our convictions, despite all the opposition we may encounter, and to withstand all the opposition we will have to endure, and to keep standing. We've got to, and we have to resolve, as I have for many years, said that if you stand for nothing, you fall for. It's wonderful when we can build bridges, but those bridges have to be more than one way. They have to go in more than one direction. And it can't be a bridge to nowhere. We should continue based on the common ground, our common values. Build those partnerships, collaborations, because standing together, that's where the power is. But the spark needs to come from someone. And I think we all have that opportunity. Now, not everybody can lead, but many of us can and must face the choice. We all in our lives have choices. And in the Holocaust, sadly, something I'm going to be speaking to a large audience about tomorrow night. All people had choices. The perpetrators had the choice of going along for whatever reason, maybe out of their hatred of Jews, maybe out of their fear of consequences for not going along. People that hid Jews and tried to save them made choices. They risked their lives to save strangers. And then there were the Jews who had what we call a choiceless choice. It was not the choice of living or dying. It was a choice of how, when, and where to die. That's what we call a choiceless choice. But the point is that we all have choices to make. And educating young people about the choices they make, and choices that reflect conviction and integrity and not merely going along. You're a psychologist. You know, we study how people will do in groups what they wouldn't think of doing by themselves. And why they do it, because everybody wants to belong. But the thing is, you'll always find examples in history, Dr. King being the pinnacle of one who made choices that most people wouldn't. Ask people today, when I lecture to a group about the Holocaust, what would you have done? And they can't answer that honestly. We would all like to think that we are honorable, that we have the conviction. So, yeah, I think the polarization, that there's a movement to polarize people, to polarize them by race, to polarize them by social status or economic condition, to polarize them by nationality, to polarize generations. The generation gap, we've known about the generation gap for years, but that polarization now has encompassed generations. People in families have been divided over ideology. There's got to be, there's that immovable object and an irresistible force. There's got to be, as there is in physics, for every action, there has to be a reaction. And I'm optimistic that in spite of the degree of polarity today, that people can rise above their differences. People can make room for difference. This is where hatred comes from, is they make no room for difference. And this is where diversity, what's another word for diversity? It's difference. But difference that we can embrace, difference that makes what we have greater than the sum of its parts. And if we could only motivate people to embrace difference and value it and realize that in the end, there's some things that are not different. I don't know of anybody that doesn't value freedom. I don't know of anybody that doesn't value competency, literacy, equality. Yeah, people may not think that, because you're of this religion or you're of this race that you can be equal. But you know, most people do. And that's not in the algorithm. That is not the group that's targeted with messages about how we should come together, stay together, stand together, speak to each other, work with each other, not on each other. That there is competition in the struggle for existence. But if we've seen anything in the animal kingdom at all, it's that cooperation. Cooperation allows members of the animal kingdom to thrive and survive. But this is where eugenics comes in, survival of the fittest. And the unfit, whoever is defined as unfit, is unworthy of life, is unworthy of opportunity. So my message is not to wait. You know, among Jewish people, we say, you know, the old saying is, good things come to those who wait, right? Forgive me, but Jewish people say, the only thing that comes to those who wait is the crap left behind by those who got there first. Now, it's what we can do now. It's not waiting for someone else to do it for us. It's seeing the opportunity and realizing the obligation. And I hope a recording like this, an interview like this, leaves people thinking more about what we can do for each other and not to each other.
And we with the reach and scope that people can communicate right now, virtually anyone in the world at any given time, even if you don't know who you're interacting with because of the distance inside. These are the opportunities. You have the opportunity right now to choose to not exist in an echo chamber, to not allow, you know, third party, big tech or something like that to simply just profit off of you by your rage, by weaponizing you as a human being. So I'm glad you mentioned as a kind of bringing that together. You know, just to kind of wrap things up, I didn't know if you had any other final remarks that you feel are worth conveying above and beyond everything that we've talked about so far.
Well, I'm going to go back to our choices. You know, in psychology and economics, you know, it's not only the choices we make, but the reasons why. And at any given point in our lives, at any given point, an old man like me, a young person like you, we are the culmination of our choices. It's real easy to find someone to blame instead of accepting the responsibility of having made the choice. And my message is this. It's an old saying. I'm pretty sure it came from Clarence Darrow, the great barrister, lawyer. He said, your destiny should be a matter of choice, not chance. What it is we accomplish, the destination that we finally reach, should be a matter of choice and intention and not chance. And my message is, as we go from day to day and year to year in facing the challenges in front of us, remember that, you know, it's one thing to talk about coming together, but, you know, in the end, it comes also down to the choices that we make. Everyone talks about the public interest. Well, the public interest is nothing but the sum of all private interests. Well, there is no more powerful motivation than self-interest. Accept it or not. The most powerful human motivation is still self-interest. But that doesn't abrogate, it doesn't preclude making choices that actually in the public interest. And that's my message.
Wonderful. There's a comment here that says, welcome home, Dr. Berkowitz, from the Ethel R. Strong School of Social Work. With that, Dr. Berkowitz, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us online as well.
Thank you.
I get one picture of you guys for to talk.